In this video, I'm going to walk you through some things to keep in mind as you are writing your materials and methods section. And there's information in Macmillan about writing the materials and methods section for your research proposal in chapter 10 on page 219, but it's really only a paragraph there. And so a lot of this information I pulled from chapter 4, pages 75 to 81, which considers in detail the things that you should include in the materials and methods section. So the main idea of your materials and methods is to explain how you are going to do your research. You should pay particular attention to experimental design. How are you going to set up your experiment? What are going to be your experimental groups and your control groups? And when thinking about your variables, what are some things that you will try to control? What are some variables that you are going to try to account for? So there's a difference between a control group, which is a group that is treated in a certain way, versus an experimental group, and then experimental controls, which are conditions that you will maintain at a certain standard, say temperature. So you want to describe your variables and your controls, and then you will also need to explain what you are going to measure and how you're going to do that. And the main idea is to include enough information so that somebody else who is reading this could perform your research. So I'm going to divide what to include under the subheadings of materials and methods. When you actually write your materials and methods section, you will not separate out the materials from the methods, but sometimes it's easier to think about organizing if you kind of separate them out. But you will write in paragraph style, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So the first thing that you want to make sure to include is all kinds of information about the organism that you are studying. So this includes complete taxonomic information, including the genus and species. Make sure you write the genus and species in the correct format. It should be italicized, and the genus should be capitalized, but not the species. And then for many organisms, you would also include a subspecies or a variety. Also explain how you will obtain your specimens. Are you going to order them from a supply company? Are you going to go out into a nature preserve and collect specimens? If so, what kind of permissions do you need to do your collecting? Include other pertinent information about your study species. What are the age, sex, what's the size of the individuals you're using? What is their physiological state? Are you working with a hibernating animal? Are you working with animals that are sleeping? Are you working with them shortly after they've eaten? So this is what we mean by physiological state. If you've treated them with some sort of a hormone, things like that. Rearing conditions, how are these animals raised, or if they're plants, how did you plant them in the greenhouse? Did you use petri dishes? What exactly did you do to these specimens? If you are using vertebrates, you will need to have a protocol approved by the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And Bethel University has an IACUC committee that meets regularly, I think once a month. And so you'll need to include that in your planning if you plan to use a vertebrate. And then if you are doing a study on humans, maybe it's a survey, maybe it's doing educational research with one of the professors in our department, you will need to have Institutional Review Board approval. And typically for the IACUC approval and for the IRB approval, typically the professor that you work with will help you with those protocols. Next, you will need to describe all of the equipment that you are planning to use. What kind of apparatus will you use? What kind of tools? What kinds of sampling devices? Are you going to use thermometers? Are you going to use a dissolved oxygen probe? Are you going to use a chlorophyll meter? What kinds of sampling devices will you use? Are you planning to use a growth chamber or a greenhouse? If so, how are you going to set the conditions in that growth chamber or greenhouse? What kind of animal cages will you use if you are using animals? Macmillan suggests not to use brand names, but I think for specialized equipment, and especially if you are using equipment that's hard to obtain, I think it's good to go ahead and specify brand names. Then if you're using any chemicals or growth media or test solutions, you should explain the composition of the chemicals and how you plan to obtain each of these materials, and then what quantities are going to be used in your solutions. Also in your materials and methods are the methods. So you will need to describe your procedures in detail. Remember again that your goal is to write out a protocol that could be followed by somebody else. So you want to include details like temperature, pH, photoperiod, which is the length of the day and night. This is especially important in plant studies. And we can set our growth chambers in our biology department to have like a 12-hour day and 12-hour night, or we can set them to 16 hours of daylight and so that would leave 8 hours of darkness. So that would be photoperiod. And then duration of your observation periods. Maybe you're planning to use camera traps, and maybe you're going to go check them every week, or maybe you're going to observe whatever you're observing every day from 8 to 9 o'clock. What time of year do you expect to do this? Now, it will be hard for you to put in exact dates for your study, but think about how many days you might need. If you plan to use a method that has already been described in a published paper or by one of our Bethel seniors in their research paper, then you don't have to repeat in detail all the things they did, but you do need to cite the source of your experimental method. And if you are planning to modify that method, then you should make sure you include that in what you write in your materials and methods. If you are planning a field study, you should explain where and when you plan to do the work, and it might be helpful to put in details like maps or drawings or photographs of your study site. Then just some general considerations. Again, you are not going to have bulleted lists. So you're going to write logically in paragraph form. I suggest that you start with an outline so that you don't end up with just a conglomerate of isolated facts that are written in choppy little sentences. If you are going to have more than 2 or 3 paragraphs, you might consider using subheadings. And I have posted an assignment, assignment 8, that includes a worksheet of all the things that you need to consider. So you will complete that worksheet this week and turn it in by Friday, October 16th. And that will help you later on when you are writing your first draft of your overall research proposal. Use specific informative language. The section of Macmillan that I mentioned before in Chapter 4 on writing your materials and methods has all kinds of examples of how, like faulty writing and revised writing that's better. So here's one example of some vague writing. I observed some monkeys in a large outdoor enclosure and others in small individual indoor cages. So that's not very specific. So what would be better is saying I observed 13 monkeys in an outdoor enclosure 10 by 8 by 12 cubic meters and 12 others in individual indoor cages 1 by 2 by 1 cubic meters. So this is just one example of specific versus vague writing. Also, since I've brought it up, this section includes lots of examples of ways to write that work well compared to other writing that is not as good. So I definitely recommend that you read through this section. Again, it's pages 75 to 79 in the 6th edition of Macmillan. Another thing to do as you're cleaning up your writing and your materials and methods is to omit unnecessary information. And I find this is pretty common, especially in novice writers. So when my freshman students write up their materials and methods for an experiment that they do, maybe it's mouse metabolic rates or respiration rates in fish, or maybe it's growing some plants, they will often give me things that I really don't need to know to understand what they did. For example, they might say, I measured the height of a plant using a red plastic ruler that I bought at Walmart. Well, you really don't need to know all that information. I think the only thing you really need there is that you measured the height of the plant. What might be important is how you determined where to measure. Did you measure to the tip of the tallest leaf? Did you measure just to the apical bud? Something like that. But omit unnecessary information. You don't need to say that you did your experiment in the lab in BAC 135 or whatever. You don't need that unnecessary information that won't help the reader understand what you are planning to do. And then let me just talk a little bit about active and passive voice. So passive voice emphasizes the recipient of some action. The plants were measured, so this emphasizes the plants. Active voice emphasizes who performed or who will perform the action. I will measure the plants. So active voice is often much easier to read. Passive voice can be just boring. So I recommend using a mix of active and passive voice, and it's getting more and more common in scientific writing to use a lot of active voice. And it is okay to use the word I. I plan to blah, blah, blah. So I think that is perfectly fine. So these are just kind of some rough guidelines, things to think about as you are writing your materials and methods, and the assignment 8 will also help walk you through how to write, or things to consider in writing your materials and methods. And I will see you next week in class.